Today, I am joined again by my dear friend Mary Harrington. She is a famed reactionary feminist, a contributing editor at UnHerd. And as I said, a dear friend, welcome back, Mary.
Thank you for having me, Alex.
It's great for you to be back. I mean, things have changed since the last time you were here, which was about probably a little more than a year ago, because you were one of the first guests on this fledgling podcast. And your star has risen. Your projects have grown. They are a multitude. And your newest project is a book that is not out yet, a book that is still being processed, called Feminism Against Progress. Mary, what do you have against progress? Do you hate puppies and rainbows as well, or what's the deal?
It's not a thing, Alex. I mean, you know that as well as I do. Come on, progress is not a thing. It's a story we tell ourselves about how the world is organized that gets used to justify all kinds of stuff, and things that like they're getting better from one perspective, but I'm not convinced that the sum total of things which are better outweighs the sum total of things which are worse ever. It really just depends on where you're standing, and I suppose what it boils down to is that if you want to believe in progress, you have to define what you mean by progress. And the moment you've done that, you've begged the question. You've already rigged the game in favor of whatever it was that you already believed. So if you want to say that it's about physical health and material living standards, then actually what you're making is a statement of values about what you think life should be about for all of us. I don't think I struggle to think of a definition of progress that you could get everybody to agree on that wouldn't in fact make life worse for some people, even if it makes life better for others. I mean, even rising living standards, over time turns out to be contributing to resource depletion and, child labor in the Congo to pay for our computers, and climate change, which is predicted to cause the starvation / migration of millions over the next 10 years or so, etc. and so on. I mean, we know rising living standards has got to come to an end. I'm of the view that we're past peak everything ready, and we're now into the kicking the can down the road and hoping we can eke out the illusion of at least standing still for a little while longer. But in my view, we've already run off. The Wile E. Coyote has run off the end of the cliff and is currently in midair, and he just hasn't quite looked down yet. There's a minority subculture, which I guess includes you and me, of people who try and look down or glance down occasionally. Mm-hmm. I mean, to be honest, it's probably no more than glancing down in my case, because there are plenty of ways in which, to be honest, I prefer to go on running on thin air for a bit longer. But to my eye, that's where we are. I don't believe in progress. I don't think it's a thing. I think it's become a pernicious myth, which is making life worse for more people than it makes life better for. The returns are diminishing so fast that the caste of people for whom progress still looks believable is shrinking by the day, and the war between those people and everybody else is intensifying. And if anything, what's, I suppose, the sort of the governing sign of everything which has happened since we last spoke on this podcast is probably that war intensifying.
Yeah. And I mean, you focused specifically on how what you're describing, the non-existence of progress affects women. I mean, why kind of highlight this aspect in particular?
I mean, the argument I want to put forward in Feminism Against Progress is that progress, as we understand it, this idea that there's a sort of never-ending arc of improvement that's both moral and material, is more an effect of the industrial era than it is an objective reality. And that we've now well and truly left the industrial era. We're into something new. I call it for short the cyborg era. Sort of the increasing interdependence of human and digital entities, if you like. The transition from real to knowledge economies, a rolling out of internet power laws into ordinary IRL existence, etc. and so on. I mean, this is all stuff that a number of your your correspondents on this podcast cover from different angles. But trying to make sense of the cyborg era is to my eye, really what your podcast guests are collectively doing. But from my perspective, the myth of never-ending progress made sense in the industrial era because it kind of looked true. Physical living standards were getting better. Progress in the sense of people becoming freer also looked like it was happening. At least if you ignored the people in the developing world, or the ones who in the servant class who were making it all possible, etc. And so, at least for the people who are in charge of telling the stories about what our culture is doing and where history is going, progress was real. It was definitely happening, and that's trickled down the value chain to an extent. But pretty much as at the point where it's reached the bottom of the value chain, or the point where progress is meant to be being rolled out to absolutely everybody, is also the point where we've run out of room to progress onto. We're now, in my view, as free as it's possible to be, and we've also entered a new age, which is enabled more by digital culture and the way that's transforming technology and the way we organize work and our lives. And in my view, the forms of progress which were specific to women, which emerged under the industrial era, once you apply those in the cyborg era, don't actually make things better, they make things worse. Certainly they, for all but a very, very small minority of extremely elite women, they make things worse. So if you look at what I think of as the arc of feminist progress in the industrial era, that looks like, first off, women being able to step away from the life of a farmer's wife. I'm generalizing, obviously, there are many women in many different situations. But if we're talking about bourgeois women in the West, the dominant story is one of ordinary middle-class women, no longer having to work as farmers' wives and being able to become, in effect, bourgeois housewives. So that's progress. Progress step one is life is just less of a grind. Maternal mortality goes down, the number of children women had goes down. This all happens very, very quickly in the 19th century. Actually, it started with the French Revolution, the great demographic transition, they call it. Women just stopped having so many children. And there are all kinds of theories about why women stopped having so many children. But I think if you live on a farm, you want as many hands as possible. You want as many people to help out as possible. But if you live in a smaller compound, or you live in a city, or life is just easier and you have that measure more control, maybe you just don't want to do that. So women start having fewer children, and then the next step is that the next phase on from that was women demanded the vote, which was justified. I mean, I know you have some reactionary correspondents who would respectfully or not so respectfully disagree with that, but to my eye, it was legitimate and completely just for women to demand the vote, because they actually lost power under the transition from an agrarian to an industrial life. Women existing interdependently with men in an agrarian setting do as much economic productive work as the men do. They just do it in a slightly different domain. And Ivan Illich is great on this. In his book Gender, he sets out how men's work and women's work, in a pre-modern setting, is strictly gendered all over the world. And it's only with the entry into modernity and into the order of the order of industrial economy that this idea appears that you can disaggregate, somebody's sex from the work that they do. And in his view, that actually disempowers women, because it shifts women from the order of the order of gender to what he calls the order of economic sex, which in his view is more sexist, because it effectively confines women to a non-productive existence, or at least it does so initially. In that women now stampede into this life as a bourgeois housewife, where essentially they're just consumers. They're not looking after the chickens and making the clothes and growing the food and doing all of that with like 10 kids underfoot. Instead of being equally productive agents in an agrarian, interdependent agrarian community, they're now not exactly free riders, but they're not economically productive in the same sense. And a lot of the ideological argument about the proper role for men and women in the 19th century which now gets dismissed as sort of patriarchal humbug under the so-called cult of domesticity. It was really about women renegotiating a valued role for themselves. Women saying, no, actually, we're the angel by the hearth. We're the guardians of higher moral values. We're educating the children. What we're doing matters. And and this is if you looked at it at scale, this is a straightforward, politically necessary from women's point of view, because otherwise they really are going to be treated with contempt, because they no longer have the economic leverage that they used to have. And then, but then inevitably, within the order of the economy, where productivity is associated with wages and working outside the home, it just doesn't really work in the end, because ultimately power rests with men, and within the order of economic sex, or at least it rests with people who are economically productive agents. So inevitably women start agitating for the entry into the workplace. Inevitably women start agitating for political personhood under the franchise, which is the emerging form of political participation under the order in modernity. Because wouldn't you? There are some women who can. It's all very. You can make it work if you have a husband who likes you, and you have a husband who likes you and enough funds to get by. The sort of the cult of domesticity works fine. But if you have a tyrannical husband, or a husband who beats you, or who spends all of the money, it sucks. And there's no way out. There's no legal means of redress. You have no political agency. So of course, as a matter of justice, women started agitating for those things, and then that gets us into the 20th century, where we've got women stampeding into. I'm glossing over so much stuff, and of course, there's so much richness and complexity to it, and internal arguments within the movement. But then the next step on from that in the sort of industrialization of the relations between men and women is the technological fix to reproductive asymmetry, which is the next big revolution, which happened in the 1960s. When this is again something which comes up. I know a fair bit. It's something you've discussed with Indian Bronson on the podcast. It's a favorite topic of his, I know, and it's something you and I talk about as well. The technological fix to reproductive asymmetry, which happens in the 1960s, just transforms everything, because suddenly it becomes thinkable to disaggregate economic agency altogether from reproductive sex, or at least to pretend that the default setting for women's fertility is off, which obviously has immense transformative effects on social and sexual mores, and also enables us all to dream of a desexed person. This idea that human beings are human personhood is separable from our physiological sex. If you fast forward several more, a bunch more decades, medical technology gets a bunch better, and the internet persuades us all that actually our selfhood is separable from our social self is separable from our embodied existence. And you have a bunch of people who are saying, no, actually, I can be any sex I want to. Because look, here's the medical technology, and look, I've grown up on the internet socializing in a disembodied way, and actually trans rights are human rights. And you can see where they're coming from. It's understandable, but the costs, the costs of rolling that out, of entrenching that in law, are immense. Not for the bourgeois elite women who are ramming it through. For those guys who are mostly knowledge workers, it's largely still in their class interests to entrench in law the idea that biological sex isn't really a thing, because that makes it easier as a knowledge worker to foreclose the possibility that somebody might discriminate against you because of your sex. And if you're a lawyer, it doesn't really make much difference whether you have Bob's and Vagine or the other set. It doesn't really matter, because cognitively it's neither here nor there. You're doing knowledge work, right? But if you go further down the food chain, it matters a lot. And the knowledge work, the barristers and the CEOs don't really like to think about this, or they don't care, or they just never really gave it any thought. But obviously, if your job is manual, it makes a great deal of difference what sex you are, because physiologically you're going to be more or less strong. And if you work in a factory, then the question of whether or not you have periods is probably going to affect your productivity. There's a good reason why there isn't an active feminist movement campaigning for 50-50 representation of women in the scaffolding trade. I mean, it's so, the reason for that is so obvious it doesn't even need pointing out. But nobody talks about it because actually the movement of 50-50 representation of women in careers is mostly a knowledge worker thing. Again, for reasons which should be pretty obvious to anybody who's a regular listener of your podcast and a thinker about the kind of things that get discussed here. And nonetheless, this idea of a desexed, disembodied, meat Lego human person is being pushed really hard, especially by graduate, highly paid female knowledge workers, because it's in their class interests. And in the meantime, it's ending. I think there was a recent case reported on of a female prisoner in California who was raped and impregnated by a transgender a male
lady.
Who was raped and impregnated by Lady Dick in prison. And there's a reason why prisons are single sex. I mean, you might say, well, who cares about incarcerated women? Well, I don't know what the statistics are in California, but in the United Kingdom, most women who are incarcerated are there for shoplifting or not paying their TV license. And this idea that it should be legitimate to incarcerate them with males who might be there for, I don't know, kiddie porn or something is just beyond barbarous. And yet it's happening because it's in the class interests of women at the top of the food chain. And that makes me really angry. I mean, I think as a feminist, that makes me really angry. And as a critic of progress, as a progress atheist, that makes me boilingly angry. So, but I don't know if that's an extremely long answer to your question.
No, it's a very good answer to my question. And I love the fact that you kind of dragged us through history to present why this is kind of reached a boiling point at this moment, and I think I had a very good point which I completely spaced on. But my next question was essentially related to abortion, because this is now the thing that is on everyone's mind with the changes happening in the U.S. Maybe happening. It's all still kind of up in the air. But abortion plays into this quite deeply, and in what is the reactionary feminist take on abortion? How should we think about it?
Oh God. This one's really difficult, and I'll start from the top, shall I? In my view, abortion, as legal abortion, is the keystone of what I've taken to calling cyborg theocracy. I borrowed the meme from somebody else, but my thesis is that at the point where we entered the contraceptive and the digital revolution, that's the point where we left the industrial era. So actually, we've been out of the industrial era for 50 odd years. It was the sexual revolution and the concurrent, actually, digital revolution. The internet was invented around the same time as the pill was legalized. That was what precipitated our entry into the cyborg era, because those were the twin things that enabled women to disaggregate ourselves from our reproductive potential, and all of us to unmoor ourselves from physical constraints, whether of our own, like, wetware computing power, or of physical distance, or really the need to be in a physical body while socializing, which is where we are now. I mean, I'm talking to you here on the screen, but you're actually, a number of hundreds of miles away from me in a different time zone. And all of these things just feel completely ordinary and familiar now because we've been in the cyborg era for half a century. But they're really gathering steam now because most of the people who were properly the people. Because the guys who remember the industrial era proper have mostly died out. Lovely. And the ones who are now in charge are the boomers who grew up, who were born around the beginning of the cyborg era, so they just don't really remember the before times. So remind me what your question was again. Sorry.
Abortion.
Abortion. Yeah.
Right.
So abortion is really the keystone of our entry into the cyborg era, in the sense that, well, I mean, it sort of depends on where you want to stick the pin, but I think the important thing is you have to see birth control and abortion as two sides of the same coin, or as two parts of the same story. Because once you introduce reliable birth control into the mix, that's the point where you've introduced a technological fix to the problem of reproductive asymmetry. This is the very straightforward and very difficult to avoid fact that the costs of casual sex are just orders of magnitude higher for women than they are for men. And for millennia, for the entirety of human history up to the 1960s, that was just a fact, and all of social mores reflected that. And what now gets painted as patriarchy and as the oppression of women and the desire to control women's bodies was mostly a pragmatic recognition of the fact that the costs for women are considerably higher for men of casual sex, and that fatherless children are a burden on society, and everybody has to deal with that. That's not a problem you can individualize. But of course, but then once you introduce a technological fix into the picture, the whole dynamic changes, and suddenly, theoretically at least, it's possible to imagine that women can play the field to the same extent as men, and that female sexuality can flourish and gamble free through the green fields like the sexuality of men, and that's all actually going to be brilliant. However, no contraceptive method is foolproof. There are always going to be oops babies. Even a 99.9% effective method has still got that 0.1% of times when it isn't. So invariably, you're still going to get accidental pregnancies. And I believe the data from America, I don't have data from the UK on this, but I believe the data from America show that in fact the total number of accidental pregnancies went up after the introduction of birth control, not down as its advocates believed, for the simple reason that the total amount of casual sex went up. Because people said, because the social mores changed so radically that just a lot more people were having sex with people they weren't married to, or with people they really didn't want to spend the next 18 years raising a child with. In any case, and so the total number of accidental pregnancies actually went up, and in turn that created a growing feminist pressure towards legalizing abortion. Because at the end of the day, if you're going to have mass casual sex, if you're going to normalize and women having sex with people they don't plan to raise a child with for the next 18 years, you have to have a backstop. And it becomes very difficult in that context to argue for the justice of normalizing the shagging and banning the backstop. That's just grossly unfair. And this is roughly the liberal feminist position now, or at least the moderately sane liberal feminist. I mean, we'll get onto the demons in a bit, I imagine. But the sane liberal feminist position now is like, look, people are shagging, and if you're going to shrug your shoulders at that and then say, well, you can't have the backstop, that's just grotesquely unfair to women. And the feminists who say, and there are plenty on the right who say, well, personal responsibility. And I think it's not unreasonable to say to those people, you really just sound like you hate women. I can't obviously I don't have insight into other people's minds, but it certainly doesn't feel very just. So that's the liberal feminist argument for abortion. But of course, once you have abortion, then it becomes the cornerstone for a whole series of arguments which have followed subsequently about what a person actually is, which is to say, for both men and women, the reproductive potential is switched off by default. All of us are a sort of sexless, interchangeable human being with body parts that we can plug in or unplug or remove or remodel as we see fit. All of us could theoretically do any job we wanted to, because that's equality, and all of us have now just sort of entered this desexed, increasingly mind-body dualist, really sort of Gnostic fantasy of what a human person is, and that furthermore, the absolute foundational cornerstone of that is this idea that none of our no unchosen obligations are legitimate, and that's true to the extent that we're willing to kill a potential life that's growing inside a woman in order to we demand the legal right to kill an unborn baby in order to if that unborn baby is an unchosen obligation. So unchosen obligations are so bad that defending the right only to choose our obligations goes as far as being able to just to snuff out another potential life. So that is roughly, I mean, so really it's the cornerstone of the sort of really radically individualist, what I call biolibertarianism, this idea that our embodiment should be wholly subject to our individual choosing. It's the cornerstone of biolibertarianism. Now, and so when you ask what the reactionary feminist stance is, I mean, this is the reactionary feminist critique of abortion. It's in a sense it ended. If you think of feminism as I do, as properly understood as the process of negotiating between men and women how to live together in whatever your material conditions are, and what that looks like in practice will vary enormously depending on your context. So that to me is the proper job of feminism, and that's not going to go away, because men and women are different and our interests don't always overlap, and that's always going to be a political question. How we try and square that so we can continue to live together, because the reality is that most of us do want to live together. I like men, or I like many men, and I dare say the same is true of most men. They like many women. Most of us would prefer to get on than not, and there's a perpetual state of mutually hostile sex wars just benefits nobody. So to my eye, that's the proper role of feminism, but the point where it becomes where you start to conflate feminism with this idea that all of us are entitled to transcend every possible limit of our bodies, then I dissent strongly from that, and from that point of view, the reactionary feminist critique of abortion as being the cornerstone of that biolibertarian mindset, which claims the mantle of feminism in the 21st century. That's very feminism, at least particularly in America, is very much aligned with this idea that we are entitled to transcend every limit of our bodies, which obviously, as I said previously, only actually applies to elite knowledge workers, because everybody else sort of lives much more in the real world and the real economy, and knows that that's only true within limits. But nonetheless, elite knowledge workers are the ones who have the mic most of the time. So that's what we get. What this means, what this would mean in policy terms from a reactionary feminist point of view, I'm less sure. I'm genuinely torn on the question of whether or not abortion should be legal. It's an immensely complex and immensely volatile question. This is something I'm still thinking through. And it's something I wrestle with on a daily basis. How to make sense of how to square the critique with the reality on the ground, and where we go next. I don't know what the answers are to that. It's something I think about a lot. It's something which I want to tackle in the book, but that's about 2 chapters hence, and I'm still on fully automated luxury Gnosticism at the moment. I'm going to get to policy in the last part and have some fun making that as radioactive as possible, but I'm not there yet.
Yeah, I completely echo this sentiment, because this is something I think about as well. Because I think we're at the point in kind of this collective critique that's now bubbling up, from people like you and other people who come on this podcast, to realize that, okay, we cannot divorce from nature. We have to recognize nature, but kind of how to integrate the fact that nature is indeed red in tooth and claw. And there are extremely vicious and violent things, at the heart of nature that abundance and technology and all of these have liberated us from in quite a direct way. And the fact that it's essentially a revealed preference for a lot of people to divorce themselves from these unchosen bonds. Like if you can have a multi-generational home right now if you move in with your parents, but right. Who wants to do that? You could get married. Anyone could get married, essentially, if you're willing to compromise enough and go out there. There are many ways to retie these broken bonds, but a lot of people essentially choose not to. And there is a reason why they make these choices, because like you said, the feminism should be the negotiation of how we live with men, but we don't have to live with men, and living with men has downsides. Like you said, you could have a good husband, or you could have an abusive husband, or someone who's constantly playing power games with you, because we have conflicting interests. It's a hard one, and to be honest, it all kind of leads me back to religion. Like, if there is no kind of transcendent set of commandments of how one should engage outside of just micro negotiating and kind of this liberal stance of how does the individual feel today, it feels like it's very hard to get that coordination without an external framework. I don't know, is that something you touch on in the book as well?
I haven't really got. I don't think I'm going to have much space to get onto to get onto religious frameworks. I'm trying to sort of. I'm trying not to make it a book of theory of everything. I mean, I think you're absolutely spot on there. It's and what we do, what any of us proposes to do about that, I don't know, because really, well, on the religious question, we are where we are, and the closest credible candidate we have to a religion that really inspires people is not one that I think either you or I would sign ourselves up to. And you know what I'm talking about there. There's this sort of rather the opposite.
Yeah, immanentizing the eschaton. That's
yeah, no thanks. but when you're faced with the fact that the ascendant religious movement of the day is rainbow Satanism, then I literally said that. Then it's very difficult to see. It's very difficult to make the case for whatever the opposite of that is, because it's difficult even to get people to agree on what the counterpoint to that actually ought to be. I mean, it's certainly true in my observation that people of any faith at all now have more in common with one another than any of them do with the other lot.
Yeah, I feel like that's essentially the uniting principle that we have now, and essentially also a reason for all the schisms that are happening. Now that I feel, kind of the dissident right. I don't know if you essentially associate with this, but you're adjacent to the dissident right, at least. It's it's ascendant. There are people paying attention. We've both been slightly mentioned in a Vanity Fair article, which is still slightly surreal to me.
I think mine was more of a subtweet.
Yeah, well, it's I think even more powerful, because you're essentially you've given birth to this concept, and it's already a faction within within this coalition of misfits.
It's a meme. It's a meme.
It's a wonderful meme, it's hard for some reason. It's hard to do podcasts in the morning because my brain's still a little bit it's a little bit slow. But what I want to say, the idea that kind of unites us all is the fact that there has to be an external transcendent standard, which is why we've also kind of departed from the IDW, because they also don't think that there has to be an external transcendent standard or a set of rules that are fixed. Surprise, they don't evolve, they're not subject to progress, that's why everyone else is at the fringes now. So essentially you have kind of the core of liberalism, or the progressives. They have pretty much the same view of life as the wokesters. They just think it's gone too far, and we, on the other hand, have a completely different perspective on how things should be.
Yeah, I mean, to my eye, the best candidate for getting us out of this mess is probably natural law. I mean, by that I probably don't mean exactly the same thing as, for example, a Catholic theologian would mean. But one of the things I found really interesting as I've been working on the book is looking at this question of what happens to the differences between men and women, which exist. They're, in a lot of cases, they're not huge, and in many contexts they're pretty trivial, but they exist, and at scale they matter politically. And one of the things I found really interesting, looking at the process of trying to do away with them over the course of the industrial era, this sort of utopian pursuit of absolute sameness between the sexes, is that in every context that I've looked at it, the utopian pursuit of sameness doesn't make those differences go away. It just reorders them to the market. So in the so-called sexual marketplace, there's this utopian idea that we'd all just be able to gamble free in the sunlit sexual uplands, which was Germaine Greer's fantasy. Didn't actually work out like that, and instead what you get is this really grim marketplace where PUAs are facing off against female dating strategists. And both of them are armed with an understanding of the normative patterns that men and women have in their mating preferences, and are using those either as weapons in an attempt to get the other side to put out, or as defensive strategies against being manipulated in that way by the other side. And so in a sense, the normative differences between us don't go away. They just turn into a supply and demand problem. So that's the black pill. But the white pill, possibly, is that in fact there is an objective reality out there, contra the IDW. There is but it might not be something that we can grasp and define intellectually, but it's something that we can sense in a Gestalt way, and that perhaps if we can keep our attention at least partially on that sort of that Gestalt sense that there are normative pattern realities out there which we can discern, and that we can order our lives to, we might actually be able to get somewhere, and we might actually be able to coordinate. So I think that's probably the white pill.
Yeah, they would probably say that yes, if these realities are based, on empirical findings, or that if they're downstream of science, then I think the IDW would accept that, because I think they intuit that there are these patterns. I think just the tools, the burden of proof that they would require is one that I don't think that reality can pony up. It just doesn't. Ethical realities are not the same as I don't know, whatever, two slit experiments in quantum physics. It just doesn't work like that.
Right, because there are always exceptions, and at the level of sort of intellectual argy-bargy, you can always point to the exceptions as though they disprove the rule. But I suppose I don't really know what the IDW take on this would be, but from the point of view, from a sort of moral normative perspective, the pattern language of human nature is absolutely the point, and exceptions to it are really neither here nor there. There are always going to be exceptions. That doesn't invalidate the need for some moral guardrails for some, if not most of the time. And so I think once you start looking at the pattern language of human nature, you are back onto terrain where you can start making prescriptive normative statements about what is or is not a better way for us to interact with one another. And of course, but then you're back into the absolute blood and guts of politics, because there are always going to be groups who are more or less constrained by whatever it is that you're saying, and that's the blood and guts of politics. There's this special pleading by whoever.
Yeah, and I think because we're kind of an empire built on the substructure of Christianity, or Judeo-Christianity, whatever you want to call it. The idea of the outcast, the misfit, the minority is it's essentially the only kind of spiritual substructure that survived. It's the idea that you do not oppress the underdog, and that gives the underdog insane political leverage, which you can see in all of these convulsions. Like, there's one thing you don't do is create these exceptions, but these exceptions, if you want to have any sort of moral, normative, stable structure, these exceptions will have to be exceptions. They won't flow into, reconstructing the system every time someone shows up and says, actually, this has disparate impact, essentially, which is, one of the cornerstones of civil rights legislation, which has kind of trickled out into the world now.
Absolutely. I think that the difficulty is, as I see it, there's a kind of, it works as a sort of two-step, in that the step one is that the the oppressed exception, the underdog, gets leveraged or gets mobilized to argue for the utopian destruction of some constraint or other, and we're sold greater freedom and gambling sunlit uplands for everybody as a consequence of getting rid of that constraint. But then what happens, because it hasn't in fact liquefied human nature, what then happens is that the market flows into that space. And whatever it is that you've liquefied gets reordered under the sign of the market, whether it's sex or whether it's human reproduction or whether it's our literal embodiment, which is now, because I mean the contemporary push, of course, now is to liquefy the idea of human nature at the level of sex dimorphism. This idea that this actually genuinely shocking idea that I see increasingly in the discourse around trans rights, that children's natural puberty should be interrupted. The default should be interrupting children's natural puberty until they've chosen whether or not they want to undergo it. This idea that unchosen obligations even extend to the normal development of your sex body. And you can now buy T-shirts for trans women you can now be seen wearing T-shirts that say "I survived testosterone poisoning," and by testosterone poisoning they mean male puberty, which is a normal and natural process. But seen from this mirror world where all unchosen physiological and moral obligations are anathema, and in fact the default should be switching all of those things off unless people actively opt in. And so, and of course, that's an extremely lucrative space. So the market flows in, and all of a sudden, we move from a space where actually puberty is just something which happens to you, to puberty being an opt-in thing which you can buy in customized form. Where you just want a little bit of puberty, or you want bobs but no vagine, or whatever. And which, of course, there's a bunch of people coining it. There's a bunch of people, the marketing, custom body parts is growing every year. I think it's growing sort of 10-15% year on year at the moment, if my memory serves me. But behind that as well, I think the stakes are much bigger, because actually the push here isn't to, the focus is on sex dimorphism because it's so fundamental, but the push is actually just to deregulate human physiology. All of it, just to deregulate the human body, much the same way as the financial sector was deregulated in the 80s and 90s, and the potential upside from a commercial point of view once the market flows into that is limitless, because at that point you're into hacking human beings and you've abolished all of the possible moral prescriptions that there might be against doing that. And where we really are into, WF, WEF, Great Reset, another penny in the Alex Jones jar territory at that point, because once you've abolished any legal or moral standing for the idea that humans have a nature, then humans are infinitely hackable. Which to me is a profoundly frightening prospect, because there's the sort of sci-fi horror movie territory. Potential for that is so immense and so deeply disgusting, but that is essentially that's the political debate that we're having at the moment. The utopian vision is one that frees all of us from our unchosen physiological obligations. The market reality is infinitely hackable human beings who've been privatized as meat commodities by the biotech industry.
Yeah,
and maybe you're going to put an Alex Jones tinfoil hat on me at this point, but but to me it's in the mail. It's coming.
Yeah,
unless we can find some way of reinvigorating the idea of natural law, or the people's capacity to discern and to understand the moral force of the pattern language of human embodiment and actually the human moral universe.
Yeah, there's essentially a lot of the things that have happened here, and like you said, the writing's on the wall. These wheels have been put in motion. Any sort of slippery slope argument that was made even 5 years ago is completely laughable now. The slippery slope is an iron rule. It's not a fallacy, and it's also tied into technology. I think how it's natural law is one thing, but the fact that any sort of additional technology is seen as an unalloyed good at the moment, I think that's all of these things are impossible without the technology to actually accomplish them. Do you think some form of I don't know, primitivism or Ludditism or something that actually attacks the heart of technology? Because I know, for example, James Poulos was on, and he's kind of in a way a techno optimist. He says, okay, we need to catechize the bots, we need to adopt technology and take it, but technology has, I feel, a mind of its own depending on what exactly it does. Like the atom bomb can probably be used for bombing and not much more. And if you have, uterine transplants, they'll be used for uterine transplants and not much more. So, it depends, the technology kind of has a utility embedded into it. So if it exists, it will be used. Can we, pull back from the brink just by law alone, or will it have to be some smashing of the machines involved?
I don't know. I've been. This is a kind of live conversation between me and Paul Kingsnorth, who's another tech doomer, and recovering environmentalist. He calls himself. He and I there are a lot of overlaps between what I call fully automated luxury Gnosticism, and he characterizes as the machine. And his take on this is that fundamentally this is not an economic or a social or a material crisis. This is a spiritual crisis, and therefore it needs a spiritual solution. Which I guess brings us back to the question of what sort of unified coordinating set of values external to radical individualism is actually going to be able to mobilize people to the point where they say no, stop, enough. Again, my best candidate for that is the gestalt of the pattern languages in the human body and human sociality in the natural world, all of which actually interact in immensely complex ways. I feel like the closer we get to being able to readjust how we look at the world to see it not in sort of empirical sciencey data gathering IDW terms, and to be able to adjust our focus more towards being able to grasp at an intuitive, if you like, at an aesthetic level, the pattern languages in things, the closer we're going to be able to get to actually solving this problem. And from that perspective, actually, it's from that perspective that I enjoy the aesthetic focus that you see a lot in some dissident circles, because I think people grasp intuitively that in fact what we need is not more discourse. What we need is not more intellectual arguments. We don't need more fucking data. The last thing we need is more fucking data. We need more beauty, and we need more people who can say, well, just look at it. You can see it's beautiful, and you can see that over there that really fucking isn't. And actually, people can see it. A toddler has an intuitive sense of wholeness. This is something which has to be bred. It has to be educated out of people. The capacity to see what's beautiful and to see what's whole, and to notice patterns, and to grasp the normative nature of things. That has the capacity to do that is just there, and you have to educate it out of people to turn them into rainbow Satanists.
Mm. And do you see potentially kind of a revival of old school religion? Like I know Paul Kingsnorth is a known Orthodox Christian. He's converted. Is there a way to, I don't know, do you see any ascendant other forms of religion, based on these patterns, or is this, there's one serious field that covers these things, and we can't really expect anything new to show up?
I don't know. I mean, my gut feel on that front is that Christianity as an institutional political force is probably toast at this point. It's probably doomed. I mean, the Catholic Church is going down fighting, which is more than we can say for Anglicanism, which is just embraced and painted itself all over with the symbols of the new regime, and is dancing merrily on the decks, with dilated pupils, as far as I can make out. at least some of the Catholics are going to go down fighting. The Russian Orthodox lot, I mean, no idea what's going on there.
Different civilizational
that's pretty
there.
wild. Yeah. Father Kirill and his lot, I don't know. Not completely sure what's going on there, but I think that's just a long way outside my manner, and probably more your territory to comment on that. But in terms as the ordering institutional, the kind of the real world power wielding face of public morality, I think the Christian church in its building constructing form is probably finished. Christianity as a force in the world, I think, is a long way from over, but it's probably going to have to go underground. Certainly if things get much worse, or go much further in the direction that they're already heading at speed, then Christianity will end up being an underground movement, much as it was, I suppose, in the Soviet Union. But in the Soviet Union and in the Soviet states, it turned out, as Richard Legutko has recounted, been phenomenally powerful, and actually what served as an agent of serious political change over time. So that's not a very definitive answer. Do I see some sort of great church emerging and governing us all to make it all better? No. Do I see religious faith disappearing and leaving us all swimming on our own? No, I don't see that either.
What do you make of the kind of the Baptist perspective, where essentially kind of Christianity enshrines slave morality? It's not necessary, and essentially, in a way, they are adopting natural law as they see it, as kind of embracing nature red in tooth and claw. Is that kind of this pagan vitalism? Any interesting alternative?
I don't know. I find, that whole worldview interests me, but it's to me, it's not always very coherent, because bits of it just read to me like shit livery with extra steps, and other bits of it, other bits of it smell like warmed over Nietzsche. Occasionally, it smells like warmed over Nietzsche via Camille Paglia, and then other bits of it feel genuinely politically urgent and necessary, and it's all mixed in together. And disaggregating which bit falls into which bucket is but that's not something I've given enough serious attention to. In my view, Bronze Age Pervert is Bronze Age Mindset is one of the most important books politically to have been written in the last decade. It's a phenomenally influential book and a phenomenally important book politically. So I would prefer to give it I prefer to give it considerably more political, more sort of close reading and close thought. It's a little while since I read it. Before I tried to answer that question in any sort of coherent way. I think it needs properly engaging with.
Yes, Gia Benechetti was on the show very recently, and we discussed kind of Bronze Age mindset. And he makes the point that it's not a prescriptive book. It's kind of it's an invocation of forces and ideas and concepts that have been dormant for a long time, and it doesn't really tell you what to do, but it kind of paints the picture of a kind of a devitalized society, and contrasts it with forces that are bubbling underneath the surface. So, what you do with that, people are doing different things with that, obviously. But I guess, like you said, it kind of has that Nietzschean core where, it's Christianity is probably not the first thing you think about once you read Bronze Age Mindset and feel like, oh yeah, you need to return to God. It's it's a bit different.
No, indeed. My sense, again, my sense is that amongst the guys who are much more engaged with this particular corner of the internet, there are some real disagreements between the guys who are broadly Christian in outlook and who are all for orderly family life, perhaps with a more generous side order of patriarchy than has recently been the case, but who are broadly speaking for living in solidarity with women and forming families, and maybe having a couple of acres and the whole, I don't want to say cottagecore, but the whole sort of, the wholesome thing. And these guys have some major points of disagreement with the, let's all go and be Pirates of the Caribbean guys. And they're too, and I mean, it might be that the difference is as straightforward as marital status. Like the guys who reached escape velocity from very online singledom are likely to have a different outlook to the guys who have not, for whatever reason. So it could just be that. But yeah, I think Gio's absolutely right. It's and one of the things I appreciate about Bronze Age mindset is that it's aesthetic rather than prescriptive qualities. In a lot of ways, actually, it reminded me of William Burroughs. It has some of the same sort of mixture of the transcendent and absolutely degenerate about it as William Burroughs. But yeah, I think it's an incredibly rich set of sort of aesthetic invitations to experiment with ways of thinking or ways of being which are currently anathematized by the sort of the reigning, the censorious reigning doctrines, and from that perspective, it needs to be. Yeah. One of the things I'd love to do at some point is read it against Camille Paglia's sexual personae, because I feel like it's in a direct line of descendants from Camille Paglia in some respects, and probably needs to be read in that context. And certainly as a reactionary feminist, that's the obvious companion text for something which makes such interesting reading from a female perspective as Bronze Age mindset.
Yeah, the difference that you highlight between kind of the trads and the cads, or maybe less the cads, the pirates in kind of the dissident right. I think it's also a difference between what time they think it is in the kind of this life cycle of the regime, because the trads essentially think there is salvation in the local. There is salvation in kind of being embodied. The people who are more of the pirate inclination think that all is lost. This is the degeneracy is so profound that you have to compromise yourself to be in relation with any woman. To actually tie your life to a woman is more of a compromise than there's no upside, or there's very little upside that one as a man in this regime at this point in the life cycle can derive from that. And I mean, this is obviously a personal feeling about where we are, and I can't fault them.
Yeah, I mean, I can't speak for what the world looks like from the perspective of some dude in their 20s now, facing the economic prospects and social milieu which seems increasingly to be on offer to guys in that context. But my sense is that were I in that position, I'd probably be a considerably more black-pilled than I am, and as middle-aged women go, I'm pretty black-pilled. Mm-hmm. So I can kind of see where they're coming from, even if it's a pretty bleak perspective, and doesn't bode well from where I'm sitting for my project, which is to say, hoping we can find some sort of functional way for men and women to live together in the future, which is a shrinking prospect under the current order. But I don't feel like all is lost, and it saddens me deeply when I hear so many young men say, to all intents and purposes, that they really do just think all is lost. I find that deeply sad, but I also understand where they're coming from. I hear the despair, and I can see how people could come to think that.
Yeah, I think it's also it's also very much downstream from the technology that we use. If you are the kind of person who's curious about about despair, about the things that there are to despair of, we find them in abundance online, and you also find people to commiserate with you about, I don't know, the fact that 2 millimeters of bone will, changes an incel to a Chad, and things like that, and there's obviously a grain of truth to that. There is looks maxing does work or whatever, these concepts actually have a grain of truth, but the reality is that life is a bit more, because this to me feels also like, they're reducing everything to a marketplace, to a spreadsheet. That's not exactly how people met in the olden days. If once you bring things back into reality, the multitude of factors that go into what actually makes someone attracted to you, or that actually leads to marriage, include the 2 millimeters of bone, of course, but they are myriad. So I think kind of pulling back from that, and the more people pull back from that, because I feel especially in the newer generations, people kind of feel like the malignancy of this, and it's, I don't know, I feel like there's going to be a movement back to mid space in some ways. People just have to find themselves somehow.
We need a proper, I mean, the sexual marketplace is obviously malign, as you say, but almost everybody buys into it. The feminists and the anti-feminists are pretty much on the same page about what the solution is, and it turns out the solution is more deregulation. Everybody thinks that in fact you should just legalize prostitution. Mm-hmm. So at that point you really do just collapse sex into the market and turn them all into the same thing. On the one hand you've got the lib fems shouting that sex work is work. On the other side you've got the incels saying, clearly the solution is to female hypergamy is to legalize prostitution and let the sexual revolution run to its logical conclusion. And so it seems to me that in fact, they might think that they're in opposition to one another, but in practice they're kind of on the same side because they're arguing for the same thing, which is sexual Reaganism. And I don't know. I kind of feel like we need an anti-capitalist movement for sexual intimacy. We need we need to resist this idea that the relations between the sexes can be reduced to a marketplace. We need to drag it back out of the claws of the market. How we go about doing, I've got a lot more to say about that than I can summarize neatly, and a lot of it is kind of chaotic stuff in my mind at the moment. So I'm not going to risk saying anything out loud at this point, because I'll just end up burning myself alive. But I have a lot to say about that, and it's something I think about a lot. But I feel like an urgent project for anybody who wants to hold out any hope for humans really having a future at all outside artificial wombs and cyborg theocracy, is dragging sexual intimacy back out of the claws of the market, and that's a multi-pronged project, which is going to piss everybody off in some, in various, the policies involved in doing that are going to make everybody angry, because it means everybody's going to have to pay some costs. And like you said, a lot of this stuff is revealed preference in one way or another. So there's going to be pain all around. Exactly. It's certainly not just a pain for the liberal feminists. Although the elite white female liberal feminist knowledge workers who are right at the top rolling out this new world for all of us will probably enjoy it the least. If we do actually succeed in fighting back, but
that's terrible, absolutely terrible.
I know it's terrible, truly terrible.
Yes, I think that's it, and it will all be downstream from a set of values that is, non-universal, which is also going to piss off a lot of people. I mean, on that cheery note, I want to ask you the question of the show, because I know we're coming up on time. Do you have another subversive thinker that you think is underrated, that people should check out or read more of, or just investigate?
Yes, I want to recommend to your listenership Gender by Ivan Illich. Ivan Illich is a very unusual. He's a priest who lived in the United States, I believe, a writer and a priest. He wrote on an extraordinary number of subjects, but he wrote a book on gender. It's called Gender, which really turns on its head the entire narrative of progress and women's liberation in ways which are just provocative to everybody. He died before the cyborg revolution really became mainstream, so it needs bringing into the 21st century. Obviously it's sort of ... the story so far, but he got very vigorously cancelled for it when the book first came out. It was and remains an incredibly subversive book. I strongly recommend. It's short, very footnoted, incredibly rich resource for anybody who's thinking in heterodox ways about the relations between men and women. So I strongly recommend Gender by Ivan Illich.
Wonderful. Yeah, we've had Ivan Illich recommended on the pod, but it was just Tools for Conviviality, and I think his book on medical practice as well. But yeah, I wasn't aware of this book, so please do check it out. And also, at the moment, I think Mary, you can find Mary in the pages or online on UnHerd. And also, we all await the book. Feminism Against Progress. You heard it here first. It's coming. I'll let everyone know when it is coming, and I'll post about it, of course. And please do follow Mary on Twitter as well at Move in Circles. You'll be back. I'm sure. I love speaking to you, and I'm very happy that you were one of the first guests on this podcast. I mean, this has been a wonderful project, and you're wonderful yourself.
Thank you so much for having me, Alex. It's been a joy as ever. We'll speak soon, I'm sure.